The first sign that something was wrong at ADX wasn't a scream or a riot, it was the silence, heavy enough to feel like it was pressing back against the walls. And in that silence, one inmate whispered a sentence that would eventually spark one of the most significant legal battles in federal prison history: "They're burying us alive." If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because this one only gets darker. For years, the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, ADX, had been described with a single phrase: the Alcatraz of the Rockies. A place built for men the country feared the most. A place where the steel doors didn't just lock people in, they cut them off from sound, from sunlight, from human voices. Inside, inmates spent up to 23 hours a day sealed in cells the size of a parking space. Some hadn't touched another human being in years. Others hadn't heard their own footsteps echo in a hallway since their transfer. ADX was supposed to be the end of the line, the final stop for the most dangerous men alive. But as months turned to years, something else began to surface, an unspoken truth that many inside the Bureau of Prisons already suspected. Men were breaking. Some slowly. Some violently. Some without anyone noticing until it was far too late. It began with letters, shaky handwriting, sentences that drifted off the page, words that didn't quite make sense. Some inmates wrote to lawyers, others to family members. Many of the letters carried the same message: something is happening to us in here. Something no one wants to admit. But inside ADX, mail didn't always travel fast. And the stories that leaked out felt unbelievable to outsiders. Claims of extreme isolation. Mental health crises ignored or dismissed. Punishments disguised as security measures. The prison's public image held strong, a fortress of order, necessary and justified. But beneath that image was a different story, one known only to those locked inside and a handful of staff who had seen too much to forget. Then came the turning point. A quiet man named Jack Powers, an inmate who had once maintained near-perfect behavior, began deteriorating. He reported hallucinations, panic attacks, and long stretches of dissociation. His letters became more desperate. He described talking to shadows, losing track of time, sinking into a mental fog he couldn't claw his way out of. Other inmates showed similar symptoms. Forgotten names. Violent outbursts. Paranoia so intense some refused to sleep. And the staff, already stretched thin, started whispering their own concerns: something is wrong on Range 13. It wasn't long before a small group of attorneys began piecing together the pattern. They visited clients who were unrecognizable from their last meetings. They collected incident reports, medical requests, and internal memos. Every document painted a clearer picture of a system that was collapsing under the weight of its own secrecy. Still, no one knew how deep the problem went, until the day a legal aid arrived for what was supposed to be a routine meeting with a mentally ill prisoner. Instead, she found him sitting motionless at the steel table, staring at the wall, whispering the same phrase over and over: "They don't see us. They don't hear us. We don't exist." That moment became the spark. The attorneys gathered their notes, their interviews, their swelling stack of evidence. And in 2012, they filed a lawsuit that would send shockwaves through the entire federal prison system: Cunningham versus Federal Bureau of Prisons. But what the public didn't know, what even the attorneys couldn't see yet, was just how much resistance, secrecy, and buried truth they were about to confront. The deeper they pushed, the more dangerous the story became. When the lawsuit landed on the Bureau of Prisons' desk, the reaction inside ADX wasn't outrage, it was calculation. Administrators closed their doors. Staff meetings doubled. And somewhere in the layers of bureaucracy, a quiet message went out: keep everything contained. But nothing inside ADX stayed quiet for long. Lawyers representing the plaintiffs, some of the nation's most volatile and mentally fragile inmates, knew they were walking into a fortress. But even they weren't prepared for the psychological terrain that waited on the other side of the steel gates. Every visit felt like stepping into a controlled storm: guards tense, supervisors hovering, inmates' eyes flickering with distrust. Each inmate told a different story, yet all the stories pointed in the same direction. A man who had once been a brilliant chess player now struggled to complete a sentence. Another sat in a corner of the meeting room, rocking back and forth as if steadying himself against an invisible wave. One described hearing taps on his vent at night, messages, he whispered, but he couldn't tell if they were real. The lawyers documented everything. Symptoms, patterns, environmental triggers. But the more they pressed, the clearer it became. ADX wasn't simply isolating inmates physically. It was collapsing their minds. And the institution knew it. Inside the staff wing, officers traded stories in hushed voices. They talked about men who smeared messages on their walls, convinced the paint was listening. They talked about inmates begging for human contact, pounding on their doors just to hear another voice. Some officers admitted they felt uneasy walking the ranges. Not because of danger, but because of the silence. As pressure from the lawsuit grew, internal memos began circulating. One warned that external scrutiny may increase. Another described ongoing concerns about mental health caseloads, though no solutions were offered. A third quietly acknowledged staffing limitations in psychiatric services. It was the closest any document came to admitting the truth. Still, the Bureau pushed back. They argued ADX was secure, controlled, and necessary. They claimed mental health care existed, that inmates had access to treatment, and that the plaintiff's allegations were exaggerated. But with every denial, the attorneys uncovered something new, a request for mental health care that went unanswered for months. A man placed on suicide watch, only to be returned to isolation within hours. A documented panic attack dismissed as behavioral acting out. Behind each record was a human being deteriorating in real time. The emotional weight seeped into the lawyers' strategy meetings. Some felt angry. Others felt helpless. One attorney admitted she couldn't sleep after certain visits. The faces of the men in those sealed cells haunted her. But the biggest shift came when they discovered a series of internal assessments, documents meant only for staff, that acknowledged a truth the Bureau never stated publicly: solitary confinement at ADX was damaging inmates with mental illnesses at a far greater rate than anyone wanted to admit. It was the kind of evidence that could change the entire trajectory of the lawsuit. But exposing it wouldn't be simple. BOP officials were tightening their grip, limiting access, scrutinizing every visit, every phone call, every request for records. And then, during a sealed deposition, a former ADX employee finally said the quiet part out loud. He leaned forward, lowered his voice, and spoke a sentence that shifted the air in the room. Some of those men never had a chance. We knew what isolation was doing to them. Everyone knew. It was the confirmation the legal team needed, an insider acknowledging systemic failure. But they weren't prepared for what came next. A discovery buried inside a set of administrative records, something so revealing, so unexpected, that it redefined the case and exposed an internal practice no one outside ADX had ever seen written down. And once they read it, they knew the fight was about to escalate far beyond what they'd imagined. The internal document that surfaced wasn't dramatic on its face. It wasn't stamped confidential or written in coded language. It was a routine operations memo, dry, clinical, meant for circulation among mid-level supervisors. But halfway down the page, the attorneys froze. A single line described a management practice used for inmates with persistent mental instability. A practice that allowed officials to keep men in nearly uninterrupted isolation for security continuity, even when psychiatric staff recommended more social interaction or therapeutic placement. In plain terms, it was an acknowledgement that mental health warnings were often overridden by security protocol, leaving the most vulnerable inmates in the most psychologically damaging conditions. That sentence became the backbone of the case. When the lawyers returned to ADX for their next round of interviews, everything felt sharper. The fluorescent lights hummed louder. The metallic footsteps echoed heavier. And the inmates, they sensed something shifting. A few dared to hope. Others didn't trust it. Many couldn't articulate their thoughts anymore, but they felt a current moving through the legal visits that hadn't been there before. The Bureau of Prisons fought hard. They insisted the memo was being misinterpreted. They argued that every decision was based on safety. They pushed back against the narrative the lawsuit was building. But with every defense, the pattern deepened. Mental illness didn't disqualify someone from isolation, it almost guaranteed it. The turning point came during a pivotal hearing. One of the plaintiffs was brought into the courtroom. Shackled, thin, unsteady. His eyes darted around the room as though the walls were whispering. When he was asked to describe his experience at ADX, he paused for so long the judge nearly intervened. Then his voice cracked, barely audible. "I forgot how to be a person." You could feel the air leave the room. Even the government's attorneys shifted in their seats. From that moment, the tone changed. The Bureau wasn't dealing with abstract allegations anymore. They were facing the raw, undeniable human consequences of a system built on silence. Behind the scenes, negotiations began. Tense. Quiet. Strategic. ADX officials knew that if this case went to trial, the internal workings of the most secretive prison in America would be dragged into public view. And the plaintiffs' attorneys knew they had leverage, real leverage, backed by documents, testimony, and men whose suffering could no longer be dismissed. In 2015, the Bureau agreed to a sweeping settlement. ADX would overhaul its mental health screening. It would expand treatment programs. It would reduce the use of extreme isolation for inmates with severe psychiatric needs. And for the first time, the most hidden corners of the prison, the ranges where men had vanished into silence, would be subject to new oversight. But the settlement didn't erase the damage. Some of the plaintiffs would never fully recover. Years without sunlight, voices, or human contact had carved fractures into their minds that no policy change could repair. Even lawyers who celebrated the outcome admitted privately that justice came late, too late for some. Yet the case marked a shift. It forced the Bureau of Prisons to acknowledge what experts had warned for decades: prolonged solitary confinement doesn't just punish, it destroys. As the legal teams packed away their final boxes, one attorney paused in the now empty war room. Photos of cells, mental health charts, redacted reports, everything was gone. But the stories of the men inside ADX lingered, heavy and unforgettable. Cunningham versus Federal Bureau of Prisons didn't fix the system. But it cracked the walls just enough to let the truth out, and once that truth escaped, it couldn't be sealed away again. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.